Thanks everyone for coming to this webinar of the River Management Society. I'm Hannah Volk. I'm a Hydropower Fellow with the National Park Service with the Hydropower Assistance Program. I'm excited to chat with you today about enhancing accessibility at hydropower sites. We have a new guide and a new resource to share with you, and we have two amazing hydropower professionals here with us today. Christy Churchill from Duke Energy, who is a recreation planner and hydropower compliance project manager, as well as Mark Ivey from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who's a senior outdoor recreation planner. And we'll be going over a little bit about the licensing process, as well as accessible recreation more specifically. And if at any point there's any sort of technical issues, feel free to give a shout out. We'll hopefully get that fixed, or if there's if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or ask, raise your hand. So I just wanted to start off and show this Hydropower Licensing 101 toolkit. This is a toolkit that the River Management Society, Park Service, and Hydropower Reform Coalition put together that goes over the different aspects of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, licensing process. It has 5 core competencies or different areas to this, and this new guide that we'll be talking about today that covers in accessible recreation lives in the natural, cultural, and recreational resources section. And I'll put a link to both this toolkit and the guide, accessibility guide, in the chat as well, so you can access those. This guide covers a number of different topics within the world of accessibility. First, we encourage folks to get into the mindset of someone with a disability, thinking more than just, someone in a wheelchair. It also covers legal requirements and regulations that one must follow, how to apply accessible recreation to the relicensing process, some key questions to consider when building accessible recreation opportunities, and lastly, some project examples and key resources. So just to start, I'll go over a little bit about the legal requirements and regulations, and then turn it over to Christy to talk more about the licensing process itself. So there are a number of legal requirements and regulations that you're looking at when building an accessible recreational experience. So first, there is the American Disabilities Act, and this applies to any basically non-federal site. So this could be any site that's intended for public use, that's owned by a private nonprofit entity, must follow the ADA rules and standards. There's also, and these get mixed up a lot, so these are a little bit confusing because the acronyms are so similar. There's also the Architectural Barriers Act, and that's ABA. ABA applies to any land or sites that are built or leased with federal funds, whether that is a federally managed property itself, or again, this built or leased by federal funds. And so there are standards associated with that as well. There are also some companion laws at the local and state level. That will be dependent on the location that you're looking at. There are also standards within federal land management agencies. The Park Service or the Forest Service has some specifications that they require. And then lastly, FERC has some regulations and rules to when looking at accessible recreation. In the Federal Power Act, FERC is required to consider recreational opportunities as well as a number of other things that they're looking at when reviewing these applications for a hydropower license. And more specifically, they are required to consider the needs for folks with disabilities. And this gets a little bit tricky because they're required to consider it, but it's not required to be built in necessarily. So we'll go over a few ways to look at how to add accessible recreation into the licensing process. All right, so how can we add that into the licensing process? First, the most basic thing is familiarize yourself with the licensing process. This is, this is really key. It's a very complex process that, there's a number of different steps. It can be, it takes a number of different years. So this is having a good foundation before championing accessibility is key. And I'd also add that it's important to subscribe to the project using FERC's e-subscription service to get any updates about the project that you're thinking about and you're working on. So as a little bit of background, I'll turn it over to Christy.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here talking with you guys today and giving you the perspective from the licensee side of the table. I work for Duke Energy and we operate a number of hydropower licenses. So this is something that I'm involved in on a daily basis. This slide right here is pretty much a very simplified overview version of the licensing process. And the green boxes represent checkpoints in the process where the public generally has the ability to, public and or stakeholders have the ability to provide comments. And as Hannah said, generally speaking, these processes take several years to get through, from pre-application all the way to the submittal, and then the license issuance comes later. And we'll talk about those steps in the next few slides. We'll talk about all of these steps in the next few slides, actually. So this first green box that we were looking at is the information gathering phase. And this occurs once the licensee submits a notice of intent and a pre-application document to the FERC. And if you are subscribed to eLibrary, you will also see that notice pop up in your email or however you get your notifications. Basically, this part of the process is alerting the FERC and others that will be submitting a license application. And these things are posted publicly on the FERC website, as I said. So if you're subscribing to a particular FERC license, you'll see that notice. And as part of this information gathering process, the FERC requires a lot of studies and data to be collected that are subject matter areas that the new project or relicensing of a project will potentially have an effect on. So some of those examples would be things like soils, water quality, aquatic life, wildlife, botanical, cultural, recreation, aesthetics, and operational studies. So regarding recreation, there's typically a pretty thorough recreation use and needs study that is done. The acronym for that is RUN, specific needs. And this will go this will basically be a study of all of the existing features that are there and the usage that is seen throughout all the sites. And generally, it's a very comprehensive, in-depth study that you get a lot of data back from at the end of. So after these studies are conducted, they are generally presented to the FERC and to the stakeholders in the relicensing meetings. So stakeholders have the opportunity to see and hear the results of the studies and ask questions in that phase. As part of the environmental review, it's important to know that there are multiple relicensing processes, and they apply differently to different projects, but we're focusing on the integrated licensing process and the alternate licensing processes because these both include stakeholder settlement agreements and typically are used for larger FERC licenses. So if your licensee has a smaller hydro license, they may be using the standard process, which is more cut and dry and doesn't involve a lot of stakeholder input. So those would not be ones that would be as easy for external folks to have an influence on. But the ones that are more often used are the integrated and the alternate, and they do include settlement agreements and stakeholder agreements of various types, in which series of meetings are conducted, including all those folks, and various voices can be heard. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the study results are presented to the FERC and the stakeholders for discussion in some of these meetings. And at the end of the series of meetings, which these take, generally several years, we're coming towards the end of one right now that we started in 2022. So that'll give you an idea of how long this process can take. And so towards the end of this process, there's something called a settlement agreement that's made, and it is a signed legal contract, and it gets incorporated into the license application and ultimately the license. And this is generally something that all the stakeholders also sign, as well as agencies, government agencies, and the licensee, of course. So it's important to understand when you're involved in this process. In general, we're talking about recreation here. So to know that your requests that you're being made are reasonable and relevant to the project, and you're not making requests that relate to something, many, many miles away and irrelevant, but it's a pet project. So that's not the type of thing that would generally be considered. So if you come to the meetings and you're at the table and you're able to present reasonable concerns and requests, then those are considered during this process. We're on to the next slide here. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm a little, okay. So we're in post licensing now. So this is where, say for instance, you come into the game after the license is already issued, which is probably most often because generally these licenses last 40 to 50 years, or anywhere from 30 to 50 years generally. So it's more common that you would be coming into a project after the license has been issued. So during this post-licensing process, what you want to understand is the recreation management plan, which is the document regarding recreation that was developed during the relicensing process and all those stakeholder meetings. So these recreation management plans are typically required of a licensee, and they are generally submitted to the FERC, they're reviewed, and then they're approved. And afterwards, they are posted publicly on the licensee's websites. I'm definitely speaking for Duke Energy, but I believe that's pretty common across the board that these plans are public and they're posted on websites for community access. So find the recreation management plan for the project you're involved in or want information about and read it. Read the whole thing. I would encourage you to do that. And as you read it, look for opportunities to get engaged. Things like stakeholder meetings are outlined. Generally there's all types of things included in the RMP. And so it would be including processes for updates to the management plan, stakeholder meeting, checkpoint periods, additional use studies, planned upgrades, and all the things that happen in between, the issuance and the end of a license. Because obviously these are long-term, so there's a lot of checkpoints and updates that happen throughout the years. And those are oftentimes when the public or stakeholders can be involved in a real and effective way with the project. So beyond that, I would say participate in providing feedback. So if you see studies being done, like we're doing a recreation use and needs run study on one of our biggest projects right now. We have surveys posted at every access area, QR code surveys. We have clerks on site talking to people. Those are great ways for people, whether you're a stakeholder or just a general user, to get involved and provide real feedback that comes straight back to the licensee that's reviewed and considered for incorporation into future changes at the project or, modifications to the recreation management plan. Oftentimes, use patterns change over time. A license might be issued or applied for, 20 years ago, and it's just now up to the implementation phase. And the uses have changed over time. There's more, non-motorized boating, less motorized boating. And so needs are shifting more in a different direction. So these checkpoints and places within the recreation management plan are where we can make adjustments to update what we're doing based on actual use and needs that are current. So these meetings and studies are things that folks can get involved in pretty readily. So lastly, I'd say, understand the way recreation projects are funded by utilities. This is a real important aspect. So I know for Duke Energy, a lot of times the funds come from generation budgets, but we're often for most utilities, we're regulated utilities, and we're regulated by a commission, and we are very limited on how we can spend dollars and how much we can spend on these items. So we don't have an unlimited budget, unlike what a lot of people believe. There's not an unlimited budget to make these upgrades. So understand that. And, in response to that, I would say, find other partners if you have a big ask or any ask at all. If you're partnering with other entities like other stakeholders, non-government groups and nonprofit organizations, various other groups, partner with them and come with a plan and approach the utility with a thoughtful and reasonable, plan and process and ideas in place. You'll have strength in numbers, and your voice is more likely to be heard and considered. Particularly if it's something that's an off-license request, it wasn't included in the recreation management plan, and it's something that wasn't anticipated and not budgeted for. So those partnerships can really take you a long way when you approach it from that perspective. Next slide. So regarding Duke Energy projects, I would say that most of our sites are barrier-free. We pretty much have that at all of our sites, honestly. And we have ADA parking and access to restrooms and fishing piers and picnic facilities. The majority of our sites are passively managed in locations that experience vandalism, and they're not being actively overseen by a lease or another management contract aside from a maintenance contract. So that makes these sites vulnerable for problems and damages. So we have to be careful about what we implement at those types of sites. We have a site that is part of our recreation management plan, and it's scheduled to have upgrades beginning this year and are due to be completed in 2027. And these upgrades are license required. They will include a swimming beach, restrooms, picnic facilities, a fishing pier, and additional parking. And so this site, we have offered to the county that it's located in at a no-cost lease, and we will incorporate requests that they have for this site, to basically help them have a site that they're happy with to take over the management of from us. And so our plans for this site is to incorporate an accessible kayak launch, and we'll do that at the time of the other FERC required upgrades. And it's much easier to incorporate things like that, which are costly, with a capital upgrade, because those costs are easier to manage than a future operations and maintenance type of cost. So we'll make those upgrades for the county along with other asks they may have, as long as they are reasonable and relevant to the project, and will help them in their future and long-term maintenance and management of the site. And once the project is complete, the upgrades are completed, it'll be turned over to the county, and Duke Energy will still have oversight of all the compliance aspects, but the county will have the day-to-day maintenance and ability to enforce their rules and manage the site and the public use at that site. So this one was a very easy one to choose in terms of not just its location and the lake that it's on, but also the fact that it will be actively managed. I'm more likely to be able to put a facility like a canoe kayak launch here, an accessible launch, because I know that it will it'll have oversight and it won't be as subject to vandalism. So that's just an example of one of the sites where we can incorporate accessible features that may not have been, addressed specifically in the recreation management plan, but we have an opportunity to include it now. Next slide. So these photos here are they're images of some of our built sites. Obviously, these are a lot of different sites all over North and South Carolina. I'm showing you examples of fishing piers that have the lowered sections for folks that need have wheelchair or shorter access needs. So we've lowered the shelf there for people to fish from. We typically prefer to pave our handicap parking spaces in concrete because it's more durable and stable, and we can be assured of the proper slopes on the concrete for the ADA requirements. So we do that. We provide access around our information kiosks in the same manner. And I'm also showing you some photos of camping sites. I've got an RV camping site in the bottom right corner. This is an ADA RV camping site. It's all completely paved. And the table there is an accessible table with the longer tabletop on one end. The one just above it is a tent pad. So this is more of a hardened aggregate surface for camping on in a tent. We've got the picnic table and such there. And then I have a picnic shelter. And under these picnic shelters, we always include a percentage of tables that have handicap tabletops that are longer at the ends for folks to access. And then our bathhouse facilities provide for handicap accessibility with all the, the various upgrades inside of those buildings to provide that service. On the bottom left is just an image of our standard restroom buildings where we've got, handicap paved flat access to the building, and the interior is very similar to the interior of the bathhouse that you're seeing in the middle there, except it won't have a shower. And these are just a few examples that kind of show some of the primary things that we provide. Next slide. This is just to show you an example of a site that we recently opened. This is down in South Carolina, and this is a canoe kayak launch site. And we have quite a bit of terrain here that we had to deal with. So we have a long handicap ramp that brings folks down to the bottom to the launch area, but we also have a stairwell. And on the stairwell, we've incorporated a canoe kayak slide inside of the handrail in the center of the stairs. And we generally try to provide that anytime we have the canoe kayak launch where we've got a set of steps. We'll always provide a handicap ramp, and we'll provide these slides, especially if it's a longer set of steps, to just make it easier to get boats up and down from the top to the bottom of that structure. And these photos were taken at our grand opening, so you can see all types of folks using the site there. The next slide here, this shows you just the site plan that's part of our recreation management plan. So this shows you a variety of things. This is a site that's existing. There's an existing boat ramp there in a parking lot. It's been there for quite a long time. We will be upgrading this site, as I mentioned. The items you see drawn in red are the items that are required by our FERC license. The items in blue are things that we've shown that a lessee could potentially utilize to enhance the site to their benefit, like campsites, campground, office buildings, concession buildings, and things like that. And then in white here, I'm just showing that I plan to add an accessible canoe kayak launch to the site. The exact location of that has not yet been determined. We'll be meeting with the vendor and the contractors to make those determinations in the field. But overall, what you're seeing here is the existing parking lot, the boat ramps, courtesy dock, locations for proposed restrooms, picnic facilities, the swimming beach, parking, and sidewalks. And that's all I have. So I guess at this time we can take questions on the subject matter that I've shown.
Thanks, Christy.
Mhm.
Yeah, feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, put something in the chat. Happy to answer any questions. There's a lot of content here to discuss. So, and there are no dumb questions. This is a very complex process. I know that I've asked a lot of questions over the course of working on this project as well. I know I can ask a question, Christy, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
So you talked about how you work with the towns and the counties quite a bit on these no-cost leases. How did that start? How did you get involved? And how did that partnership start? Did they come to you? Did you go to them? How does that work?
So Duke Energy began a process called the Axis Area Improvement Initiative a number of years ago, and it was something that was part of our Catawba Watery license application. It's in our license, it's in our recreation management plan. So during that whole stakeholder process that we went through from 2003 to 6 for the Catawba Watery license, where we met many times with 80 different stakeholders throughout the process, it was basically laid out which sites, including Fishing Creek, would be upgraded and what we would put where, and which entities were interested in partnering with us in managing some of these sites. So there were certain times when a certain county would come to Duke Energy during that relicensing process and say, well, we really need more camping here. Would you consider adding RV and tent camping, or whatever it is that they wanted at this site, and we will lease and manage it as a county park for you. And we were like, absolutely. And so an agreement was made, and then the parameters for that were incorporated into the relicensing agreement, and then ultimately transferred into the license and the recreation management plan. So sometimes those were prearranged. Now, again, that was 20 years ago when some of those agreements were made. Others, I just reach out to various counties. So if we have a site in a particular county that I know I'm about to upgrade, I'll approach the county or state entities to see if they're interested in taking it over. And if so, what would they need? What would we need to do for them to get them interested in managing it for us? So oftentimes when we get to the point where we're about to upgrade an existing site, that's when I will make those reach outs to the various folks that I think might like to take it over. We have about 32 of our 144 sites that are leased right now.
But you also look for feedback and things like that, right? Can you speak a little bit to the surveys and you mentioned earlier the surveys and the clerks that you have at the sites who are looking for feedback on the sites and how you can incorporate that?
Right now we are conducting one of those recreation use and needs studies for the Catawba Watery project. And as I mentioned, we have the QR codes, and they are posted. They're site specific, and they're posted at every single access area that we have on the project. And I believe we have 64 sites on this project. There are 11 reservoirs. And so when the public scans the QR code and answers the survey, the results are provided to me by our consultant that's managing that overall project. And, at the end, and I'm reading those like as we move along through the season. This study is a recreation season long. So it's this year, it's from April to October. And at the end of the season, all those surveys and all the data that we get will be compiled and put in a pretty large report, and it'll outline all the usage. It'll provide summaries of all the feedback and the comments that we received, relevant comments, that is. And when we get those comments, obviously they again are incorporated into the final report. The report is shared with stakeholders, but then it's ultimately shared publicly on our website. And so in addition to that, it's submitted to the FERC, and the FERC reviews all of that data. and the feedback, and they can respond to those surveys or those studies and direct us to do various things based on the feedback that we're getting, especially if there's a very large contingent of the same type of feedback requesting the same type of feature or things of that nature. And so as a result of the studies and public comment, it could result in a FERC order for us to incorporate something into the projects. Or it could just be something that, there's a lot of smaller comments. We've had comments like, it's really dark at this site, we'd like to have more lighting. And so we'll go ahead and see what we can do to provide solar lights or some other type of lighting if we don't have power nearby near the site. We find ways to certainly address those concerns, particularly when they're safety and accessibility related. So again, the comments come in, they go into the study, they get submitted to FERC, they're publicly, available. In between these studies, which for us, for this project, happen every 10 years, we also have email inboxes that people email us to. A lot of times those messages are not as specific to the type of feedback you would get at a use and needs study. It's more management, day-to-day management issues. But there are various ways that that you can reach out and be heard.
That's great, Christy. Does anyone else have any questions for Christy before we turn over to Mark? You feel free to come off mute, or you can put them in the chat as well. Okay. Well, yes, Lisa.
Hi. Let me put this down. Do you often, are you often contacted, or are you ever contacted by an entity that says, I'd like to be involved in the process with providing input on accessibility? Like a larger picture participant in the process, aside from responses to a survey or complaints about, a specific request?
So I have not been contacted in that manner. I am not opposed to being contacted in that way, but if there's a group like a nonprofit group or some organization that has that desire to be involved in the process, and there's a relicensing process that's occurring, they can request to the FERC to be put on the service list for that project and potentially involved in that relicensing process. So that's one of the best ways to start. That's not always possible because, again, these relicensing projects, they don't happen super often because the licenses are long. But they can also occur during these checkpoints within the recreation management plan timeline. But if a group wanted to set up a meeting with us to discuss this and plans and an overall process that made sense and was a partnership, we would be open to that. That has not happened, but we would be open to it.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Risa. All right. Yeah, again, feel free to put anything in the chat, but for now, I'll pass it over to Mark Ivy.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Ivy. I'm an outdoor recreation planner with the Commission. A lot of people are surprised to learn that we have outdoor recreation planners. It is one of the many resources that have to be considered during the licensing and management of these hydropower projects. I've been working here this is my 17th year, and I know that the licensing process is very complicated. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, don't feel bad. We usually tell our new staff it takes about 5 years to really feel like you're starting to feel competent with the program. So always feel free to reach out to our staff. We're happy to help answer questions if you're unsure about a process and you're working with a licensee that may not be able to provide you as much assistance as Christy can do with Duke. I do have to tell you that while I'm a commission staff member, I do not speak for the commission. We have a 5-member board that runs the commission. they are the final word about what happens. So if they decide that something's different than the way we've done it before, they can make changes. But we are typically an agency that kind of follows precedent. And I can share my experiences with you. So feel free to ask any questions. Be happy to know that there's actually people out there listening. It's kind of an odd way to present being in a webinar. So what else? I wanted to talk first about language. It's really important to use person first language. So I have a very good friend of mine who happens to be blind, and I do not introduce her as my blind friend because blindness is not what defines her. So I could introduce her as my friend who is blind. And that really does make a difference for how you think about people. We all have various levels of ability. I feel like I don't have any disabilities, but here I am wearing glasses. So I do not have perfect vision. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And talking about the spectrum of abilities, there's also a spectrum of experiences that persons with disability want to engage in. And so you can't assume that every person that has a certain type of disability is going to want the same outdoor recreation experience. So I know folks that have a walker or a wheelchair that will not go off pavement or asphalt. It's taboo to actually go into grass or gravel or any other surface. And the other end of the spectrum, I know somebody that has an off-road wheelchair, and he goes on trails, and if he has to, he climbs out of his chair and drags it along with him until it's wide enough to get back in and keeps going. So, when you're making something accessible, there's levels of accessibility. And we do have the guidance from ADA and ABA to tell you what's the minimum requirements in certain situations. But also reach out to the folks in your community, your user groups, and talk to those people with disabilities and talk about their needs and see what you can do to try and make an experience that they're looking for. And when you're building these recreation amenities, you want to think about how are they going to get to the site once they get there, how are they going to park and get out, get to where they need to go. You never want to assume that people with disabilities are with other people. So you want somebody to actually be able to use your site solo. And that's a very different mindset than some folks have. There's something called accessible routes, which link various parts of your site together. So you might have an accessible parking lot and an accessible picnic table, accessible bathroom, and you can't get from one to the other because you don't have the route to connect them. So that's important to think about that too. I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. And please feel free to interrupt me as we go through these. So I like to put this sign up because this has the logo for accessibility at the top of the stairs. So it's not really very accessible. But once you get there, if you can, and you go inside, then it's accessible. And I also like to point out that a lot of these signs have Braille on them. But if you have visual difficulties and you don't see very well, how are you going to know where the sign is to try and feel what the sign says in Braille? And also you should know that there's a high percentage of people who are blind that can't read Braille. So sometimes raised lettering is just fine. Next. Put this slide in so you can see there's a blue marker on the lower left-hand corner of the slide. And that's the accessible parking space. And you can see that there's accessible picnic tables. There's some grills in the background by the railing. And so you've got a nice site where people can come and of all abilities can use the site, have a nice view, have a picnic, use the barbecue. But it is entirely paved. And so is that the experience that someone with disability is looking for? Could you use a different surface that is also accessible, like engineered wood fibers or compacted stone? So just make sure you look at all the various ways you can make sites accessible. Go to the next one. Now, this is a good attempt to try and provide accessible picnic tables that are covered in case it rains. But you look at the trails and they're fairly narrow, so only one person with a walker or a wheelchair can travel on them. And once they get to the picnic table, they can't really get under the shelter or get around the table. And so you have to think about the big picture of somebody actually using the site. And that's where it's really helpful to talk to persons with disability to see, well, what's needed here. Next. This is a nice kayak and canoe launch, but it may not have all the features that someone needs to use it alone. So if I'm in a wheelchair and coming out here and trying to maneuver out of the chair, get my boat onto the rack, climb onto the boat, have my chair nearby for when I come back, does this site really meet all the needs for someone to use it on their own? So this site was designed more in the mind of someone traveling with another able-bodied person that can help them use the facility. It's not a bad thing. I mean, it's universal access. It's great. Everybody benefits from this because it makes life a lot easier getting in and out of a canoe or a kayak. But it's just not, didn't go 100% to allow someone that's on their own to use it by themselves. The next. This is a more less developed site where you've still got a lot of nature around. You do have the accessible picnic table. You've got a hard surface. You have a barbecue pit there that you can use. That table that's there does rotate back and forth, so you can move it out to the side and then push it back over the fire. But it would be difficult for someone with a wheelchair to use it.
Bob.
Oh, we have a question? No? Oh. Okay, thought I heard somebody ask them. It's nice when you have a picnic or a barbecue like this to have a guide that keeps the coals off of your lap if you're trying to turn the cooking surface back and forth over the flame. The next. This is an interesting site. It's the start of a pretty famous four-wheel drive trail. And they put these poles up because people are actually trying to drive up to the window because they wanted to prove they could drive anywhere. So they wanted to keep people from doing that. And in the process, they made it so you really can't get to the window unless you're able-bodied. So they didn't think about that when they made those changes. The next. And here they, for some reason, decided to move the barbecue off the paved surface, probably because they need to get around the backside of the picnic table. So they improved the access to the table, but the access to the grill is not as good. And here you can see that the grill also does not have the guard in front, so you have to be worried about coals coming off into your lap. And the water faucet is completely inaccessible here. So there's some minor changes that they made, but they were trying to address one issue and just made things a little bit worse for other issues. Next. And this is a spot that shows where you can lower the guardrails so you have a place to fish from your chair, or you can sit on your walker or be able to actually fish. But the thing here is, if you catch a fish, how hard is it to actually get your fish out? It's nice to have an opening that's wide enough that you can reach through and get your net or get your fish, so you don't have to take it all the way up and over the railing. So that's just something else to think about when you're making accessible fishing places. Next one. This is a really interesting idea in Southern California, where they've got floating restrooms on these heavily used reservoirs. And so it's great. You can just run your boat right up there and hop off, use the bathroom, hop back on, and keep going. And the issue here is they've not made these accessible at all. And so what they should have done is to make the door a little wider, make it a little transition zone a little better for people to be able to maneuver off the boat in there, use their restroom, and get back out again. But just in concept, these are awesome. It's a really good idea for a heavily used reservoir. And next. And this is a really nice fishing site that gives you a shade. It gives you picnic tables and benches and barbecues and trash receptacles. Everything's accessible. So just think about the big picture. If you want to come and spend some time at your site, what are the different steps you can take to make it accessible and also just easier to use for the entire population? Just wanted to show you all of these sites to give you an idea of what's possible and some little things to look out for. And go to the next one. This was an interesting try. You can see there's a accessible parking there. And the goal here was to be able to drive a car with a trailer and have the boat on its trailer be able to be up next to this ramp. And then you could go use a walker or a chair to go around and get up and then access the boat from this. And it was a nice try, but I think some of you could probably identify some issues with how this might be a challenge. And I don't know if anybody wants to chime in the chat to say what kind of things they might change about this. I don't know if we're getting any takers. No? Okay. Yeah. So one of the big issues is, again, as I mentioned before, are these people with disabilities traveling by themselves? And so if they are traveling solo, this is going to be of zero use to someone that wants to go get into their boat. But it's a nice thought for those that are traveling with other folks. All right, move on to the next one. And then we're talking about beach access. There's several different ways you can facilitate access across sand. And you can see there's some rubber mats there on the right. There's a nice wooden structure. But with the wooden structure, once you get down to the beach, you really can't go anywhere unless you have a sand chair. And somebody might have their own. And some sites like this will have sand chairs available for people to borrow. But the upper left shows you a nice ramp down, and then the surface that's actually kind of bolted down into the sand. So that mat will lead you right out to the water. So it's just, how far can you go to actually get people to access the water rather than just be able to come and see the sand in the water? And what activities can they participate in? Next. This site, they've got a pretty high curb there, so it's kind of hard to get up and down that. And you've got the floating dock, which is great at a boat ramp. And you can see that the ramp that extends from the boat dock up is slides as the water level goes up and down. So it's really difficult for a boat launch to have that, where you have a reservoir that changes quite a bit, to have a good slope for people that want to use a wheelchair or a walker or some other assisted device to get up and down. It's a big, huge challenge for folks. You can make, the longer the span is, the less it'll have to go up and down. But you could take steps like providing a railing to make it easier, at least have something to hold on to as they're trying to navigate down, to the boarding float. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was in the foreground of the picture, you can see the blue line in the lower left, and that's an accessible parking space right next to that nice big curb. So you got to think about how you're getting your route from your car to get out there and board get up there, read the sign, and also get out there and board the boat. So it's a holistic take you have to have for your site. Yeah. Next one. Yeah, this one you've got the grass accessible parking spot, and there's nothing wrong with that if you've got a nice stable service there. So you can have it. It looks nicer. It's pervious. It's not like asphalt or concrete. So as long as you're maintaining it properly, that's fine. And there's a hole next to the largest boulder there on the right, so it's big enough you can run a wheelchair through there. You just have to be very aware of how that surface wears over time with use and rain and other weather that you might experience at that site. So you can be creative and have different surface types. Just make sure you're on top of the maintenance and keep it so it is accessible. And then the ramp down to the pier here is a little bit steep, and so you might be a little bit aware that if someone in a wheelchair kind of lost control, they would just be launched right into the water. So just think about using this by different folks and what their experience might be like. So is there anything you can do to kind of limit their anything that might happen to them if they lost control? So you could put a guardrail down at the bottom so that they at least run into that and not go off the edge. Or so just again, big picture.
I think that's one of my favorite photos of yours, Mark, is the ramp that launches you off into the
right
there.
Well, and it could be fun.
That's true. Maybe that's a feature of your site, not so much
yeah, put in an escape ladder and let people swim.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Do another one. So in this one, there's a bench with a nice cement surface, but there's no way to get to it unless that happens to be a nice compact surface that's accessible. And then on the upper right, there's the little fishing pier, but the gap there between the asphalt and the concrete footer is higher than it should be. So you have to be aware of a difference in height that might stop someone with a wheelchair or someone that can't lift their feet up very well from being able to shuffle on out there. Was there something in the chat?
Yeah, we have some. Oops, I apologize. Let's go back here. I have some 2 really great questions. In the question one, in the chat one, is can you provide information about the legal frameworks for the consideration of recreational activities and accessibility at hydropower sites?
Okay, that is a good question. I'm glad somebody's listening. Yeah, so as Christy and Hannah both talked about, we have to consider the needs of a person with disability at licensed hydropower projects. So when we get a recreation plan that's filed with us, we look to see if there was some kind of assessment done to see how they could provide activities and accessible features. It doesn't mean we require every licensee to make every site 100% accessible. It's just licensees have to demonstrate that they've thought about it. If there's an issue at a site, we as a federal agency are not able to enforce ADA. That's Department of Justice that does that. And so that would be another avenue to consider if you find that some of the hydropower sites aren't providing a reasonable accommodation for folks.
I might actually jump to Susan's question next, since hers is kind of related to that. So when you see some of these examples and missing gaps, is that something FERC would weigh in on through compliance? What factors would you consider when deciding if and how to recommend changes?
Well, we do what's called environmental inspections at our projects. And we try and see sites on a 7 to 10 years rotation. And so once we're out in the field, we would find, most of these pictures are from hydropower projects. And we talk to the licensees who are out there and point out the various things that they should fix to make the sites more accessible. So that's the best way for us to have direct input. That and then through the review of the recreation management plans.
Can you provide some examples of improved river access sites and how environmental flow regimes have been taken into consideration to enhance use and accessibility? That's another question we have.
Environmental flow regimes. So that's is that you're talking about fisheries, or I'm not sure what the questioner is thinking about there. Like aesthetic flows, rec flows, fishery flows.
Questions from Matthew Terry. Do you want to come off mute or add something in the chat to clarify? We can try to answer your question.
Well, sure. I guess my observation was that there was a lot of focus on reservoir accessibility, and often we find that the consideration of recreational river users who have flow dependent accessibility requirements, uh, which could be aesthetic, could be for aquatic ecosystem uh, maintenance, or it could be for the quality of the recreational experience, or the feasibility of a recreational experience. Uh, Usually these, are rolled in some form or fashion into environmental flow considerations, which in some cases may be a very, the flow regime may be a very limiting factor or challenging factor when designing a river access if you have extreme fluctuations in flows and and with terrain. And I was just, curious how you were addressing some of these needs, especially for people with accessibility challenges.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for coming off mute and talking to us. Um, it's good to have the question. Yeah, we do sometimes find where there's a big variation in flow downstream of the dam. Like you may not be able to put in a floating fishing platform because it would get just washed out. So we do talk to licensees about having fishing access at various levels on the stream bank. So you might have one down close to low flows, another one at medium flows, one at high flows that are just like a cement ramp that goes down. So you can go down and get lower and closer to the water at the various flow levels. Um, you do have to be really careful that people that are there recreating know that when the siren goes off, they have to move because the water's coming up. So yeah, there's that element of danger there as well, and that's a reason why some licensees are opposed to trying to provide access at various levels. So it's got to get involved in the process, demonstrate that there's a need for those access points, and then work with the licensees to try and make that happen. And as Christy said, you get involved in the process and stay involved in the process to get your voice heard. That's the best way to do it.
I guess what I would add is often there's been resistance from some of the licensees to provide access for recreational river use at hydropower sites, claiming the risk factor is too much of a liability for them. And yeah, I guess that would open the door to maybe another subject would be liability in general when you're dealing with making these sites accessible, and you have reservoirs that can be drawn down and maybe present other challenges that you may not see in the photo that you're looking at right now.
I would agree with you on the legal challenges there, because I can tell you that our attorneys at Duke Energy weigh in heavily on a lot of things that come up at our projects. And if they are against a certain feature or something that's been asked for that's not part of the federal license requirement for that project, because they feel there will be a liability related to it, then we can't do it. So that can happen. I will say we did focus, at least I focus more on reservoirs because that's probably 95% of what we have at our sites. So we have some river access, but those sites are for they're for rafting and commercial outfitters and more so things like that. We do have some concrete fishing platforms that are accessible at some river sites, but I would say the vast majority of our recreation access points are all on reservoirs.
Yeah.
Susan.
Hi. Yeah, I guess I'm curious a few things. Christy, when you were saying the liability, I mean, I'm wondering if you have any tips or things that people would think about if they're thinking about a project that they want to come to the licensee around that to make it more likely that it would pass. That, you know, is there some factors to consider that you've seen? Okay, these are when the partners have this information, it's helpful for the attorneys to say yes, or yeah, curious about that.
I really haven't seen many cases where we've been able to change the minds of the attorneys. I really haven't. It's generally going to be deferred to the state laws and the recreation statutes that are relative to the state that you're in. So it can change from state to state, but generally speaking, those recreation statutes and the local laws are going to be relied on heavily. So changing it from that aspect may be a better approach. I've not seen many cases where we've been able to sway the attorneys. I mean, generally their responses are very well thought out. They're not just immediately saying no to everything, and we do have dialogue with them. But they have, you know, a backlog of experience and case studies that they're also drawing from in terms of responding to certain requests.
Okay, thanks. I mean, it sounds like, you know, knowing what those recreation use statutes are could be helpful, and just kind of building on that.
Very much so, because some of them are tied to fees. So if it's fee based, so if you're charging somebody to use the site, then you take on some liability. But if it's free public access, then the public is deemed to be taking on that risk themselves. There's a personal liability there that you take on yourself. So it is important to understand those varying statutes from state to state.
Yeah, that's helpful. You know, I can maybe ask my other question that I had in the chat, which I was thinking about for Mark, but really kind of for both of you, maybe in terms of Christy, for your partnership projects that you've had. What, just, you know, we're seeing a lot of things that, you know, have worked well and things that haven't worked well. These pictures are great, and all the examples you shared, Christy. But I guess just thinking about this, like, is there any lessons learned from, like, what either the partnership projects, what has worked well, like what factors went into that, or, you know, market, the things that you're seeing at these hydropower projects, like what did they do right that could be kind of lessons learned for us as we move ahead?
What do they do right in terms of accessibility?
Right, or just how they put their project together. Yeah, like what makes those successful partnerships for you? Yeah.
So we have a lot of different types of partnerships. We have some where the cost of the entire park was split, you know, 50-50, 60-40, however it may be. So we've got a very large park that had a lot of FERC requirements that were tied to our license, but the entity that was leasing it from us wanted to add additional things that were not part of the license, like a playground and primitive camping, because that was not included. We did provide RV camping. So basically Duke Energy and the county split the cost of the upgrades for that site. And overall, it became a much better site and a much more useful resource for the community because of our collective investments. You know, it's you know, at least twice as good as it would have been if it was just us or just the county building that park. So when you're able to pull your money together and you have, you know, a lot of various resources coming together in a park, you're able to provide more options for a wider group of people. So the park I'm talking about, you know, includes all kinds of trails. There's accessible trails. There's all different types of picnicking experiences, camping. There's canoe kayak launch. The launch is not accessible, but there are a variety of things that were able to be incorporated into that site as a result of the partnership that probably would not have happened if it was just a, you know, strictly FERC required amenities that were provided there. So I mean, that's one thing, but the other big benefit of a partnership is for us to know that this entity is taking care of and overseeing our investment. And they're also adding bits of their own investment to the site. So if we're spending $150,000 on a kayak launch, we know that they're looking after it on a daily basis. It's not just sitting out there in the wild, wild west, subject to vandalism and public abuse like a lot of sites are. So that is a big advantage of a partnership, is that you're able to gain a lot more control and oversight and protection of the park that you don't get when it's passively managed. So I'd say for us and the community, that's one of the biggest benefits of these partnerships.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah, I've seen some nonprofits come in that are like promoting river trails, water corridors, and they will come in and they'll establish campsites and docks and take on the responsibility of operating and maintaining those, so that the licensee doesn't have to. That's really helpful too. I'm curious, Christy, is when you have these sites that are both the county and the licensee sites, is liability split at those points too, or is that still all entirely your liability?
No, we generally transfer that to the lessee as a part of the lease agreement. However, a lot of the counties and states have indemnity clauses and other things, and which make it harder for the public to sue them. But they would take on that liability in general. If they're not maintaining something and there's a hazard, it would fall to them. However, we all know when big things happen and people are taking legal action, they will take a stab at every single person that has any type of ownership or link to that site. So that doesn't mean that we wouldn't be included a lawsuit.
Okay. And I saw a question about liability at the federal level, and no, there's really nothing that where the federal would overtake the state's rights on as far as liability goes that I'm aware of. So.
We have another question about, I think this person is looking more at a particular situation, but we have a question about if public access to an impoundment, and this is a hydro dam that is owned by a private entity, not a public utility, if they have not been previously required by FERC, if public access to this impoundment has not been previously required by FERC, will FERC access or assess the potential need for recreation access during the license renewal process, especially given an increase in public interest?
Yeah, that can be part of the relicensing process, as long as you're getting involved in saying, these are the reasons why we feel it should be available for public access. That being said, we do have a few projects where it's entirely on private land and there's no public way to get to that water course. So, like there's some ranches that have their own hydropower projects within their ranch. And, we're not going to force the rancher to say, oh yeah, the public can now use this because you have a hydropower license. So it's always, with most things at FERC, it depends on the situation. But yeah,
And then
definitely
there's other types of reservoirs, like the pump storage reservoirs, that are not publicly accessible for safety and functionality reasons, obviously. But so in a case where you have a pump storage reservoir that is not publicly accessible, there's probably other recreation facilities that are outside of that immediate area of the reservoir, such as trails or access in other ways that are tied to that federal license, but they're not reservoir specific.
Right. Yeah.
That question was mine. I just have a follow-up question. If the dam also blocks passage to the river upstream, does FERC consider that there's no way to get to, a public waterway?
Are you talking about a portage, the need for a portage?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, like I say, it's an issue you should raise during the relicensing process and provide justification as to why that's needed.
Okay.
We've also had external entities come to us requesting portages around various dams of ours. Some of them are not hydro dams. Some of them are. Generally, we provide some type of portage option at all of our hydro dams. Either they are already there or they are intended to be implemented in future years. But we have worked with municipalities and counties to help provide portages, especially if we don't own the land that's adjacent to it and whatnot. So that, you know, if a portage is needed, that would be a good opportunity, if possible, to find partners to help facilitate that. It's not always the case, but that's something to consider. And, you know, dams are highly hazardous areas. And so I know for the FERC projects, there's an enormous amount of dam safety considerations, concerns, and requirements that are tied to those dam facilities. So, you know, that will also factor in terms of, like, you know, where a takeout would be, where a put in would be, and how far away the portage needs to be from the actual dam structure and things like that. So there's a lot of different things to consider. It's going to be more specific to the site you're speaking of, but look for that may be a good partnership opportunity if it's not already required.
Okay. And when you mentioned partners, are you talking about like adjacent property owners, if there are any, or just other public,
Adjacent,
local?
yeah, adjacent property owners, the county recreation department, if there is one, the municipal recreation department, any type of local government that may be able to help you, and also potentially a nonprofit organization that may be interested in helping or have ways to get grant money to help facilitate something.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that guidance.
Yeah, and I need to jump off to catch a bus home. Sorry, but feel free to follow. You've got my email address, and I think my phone number might be available as well from Hannah. So feel free to follow up with me later. We can talk offline about any other questions you have. But,
Thank
thanks
you,
for
Mark.
coming and participating.
Thank you, Mark.
Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, Matthew, do you have I'm hoping one of us can answer it if you were looking for an answer from Mark, but
in terms of well, if Mark still has any time to give his perspective, that's great. But for Christy, I'm just curious, how many lawsuits do you get faced with in a given year or something for reservoir use or any of your access points? You have a large number of public access points. Is liability really an issue? I mean, is it? I mean, do we have?
It is. So I would say we don't have a large number of lawsuits, but the ones that do come up are big. So we try to prevent those things from happening. You know, a number of times lawsuits come up that are not relevant to us or a result of our negligence. So I'd say there's more of that than anything else. And so generally we are not, you know, at fault there, but there have been times where a warning siren didn't go off, or signage was missing, you know, warning people of a low head dam or things like that, where it could be a problem. And so in general, we just really try to be risk averse. We don't want to open ourselves up to the potential. But actual lawsuits are not common.
Okay. Can any of that be liability be mitigated simply by posting a sign at the entrance that you are not liable and you're using this access at your own risk?
We do, and we have posted signs everywhere. The problem is the signs get stolen, they get shot up, they get painted over, and we can't go visit these sites in remote locations, you know, on a regular basis. There's absolutely no way that we could get to them all. So you're still leaving a window of a problem there with that. But we do have a lot of signage at all of our sites, and I would say a good bit of that signage is the result of legal actions.
I think it'd be interesting to kind of follow up, you know, at some point with, especially with FERC, trying to understand a little more about risk and liability at the national level, and you know, some type of evaluation, kind of what, you know, classifying the types of liability that are observed, and you know, risks and the outcomes of a number of these things, I think would be helpful for a lot of people that are working on accessibility. I think it'd be really important to understand, what people are dealing with in
Right.
terms of that.
I
And
would say, I would say, and not to interrupt you, but there hasn't been a time, at least for me. Now I've been at Duke for 15 years, but and I will say the request for accessible features has been more recent, like in the last 2 years, honestly. Prior to that, we really didn't get a lot of requests, maybe one in the 10 years prior to that, right? So anytime we've said no, it has not been a liability reason for us, and I'm only speaking for us, right? So we generally will try to find a solution. I would say it's more likely that the reason we can't make something accessible is due to the natural features, the terrain, the constructability, the permitting issues, the limits in terms of what the Corps will allow us to do, and things of that nature, much more so than a liability aspect.
And I think one thing to add too is something that I think we've talked about at other points, Christy, is making sure that before folks arrive at whatever the site is, there's information provided on their website about what kinds of things are at that site. So folks can make decisions ahead of time about whether or not they want to go. And I think that provides, I think that's probably helpful for liability, but also just across the board in general. Because not everyone, as Mark was saying, not everyone is looking for a perfectly paved service.
Right.
If you're saying there's a bit of a slope, that's what's here, come use it if you'd like. I think that can go a long way, and it's pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of cost, just being able to provide that information ahead of time. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I will quickly just pop back to the slideshow here to share. You guys see this? Does that work? Or no?
Not yet.
There we go. Awesome. Okay, so we have a couple more. This webinar is the first of a larger hydropower practitioner webinar series. So I wanted to thank you for coming to our first one. There'll be two more in May 14th at 2 p.m. same time Eastern. We'll be talking about valuing hydropower in a changing energy landscape. And then in June at 12 Eastern instead of 2, be talking about how to get what you want or just show up. So those are some future webinars that we're excited to host. And then, of course, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to myself, Christy, or Mark. Any concerns you have. We have a few extra minutes here, so if anyone has a question, happy to take that. But if not, thanks for coming to our first webinar here, and hope we provide some good information for you. Oh, and I'll put the guide in the chat as well.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Great presentations. Yeah, appreciate it.
You. Thanks, Christy.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you very much.